Well, welcome everyone. It is now that appointed hour, so we're going to go ahead and begin. I'm Jonathan Haupt. I'm director of the Pat Conroy Literary Center, and I want to welcome you all here to the main branch of the Beaufort County Library for our Visiting Authors program with Nicole Seitz in conversation with Bill Thompson. Our visiting author, Beaufort native Nicole Seitz, is now the author of 7 novels, most recently the historical mystery, The Cage Maker. Unlike Nicole, I have a copy of the book with me. This was published by Pat Conroy's Story River Books imprint from USC Press, and is a novel for which Nicole is both the author and the illustrator. New York Times best-selling author Julie Cantrell praised The Cage Maker as, quote, one of the most original and fascinating stories I've read in ages. With elaborate settings, mysterious characters, impressive illustrations, and tons of suspense, Seitz has delivered a captivating time-slip novel that escapes the confines of genre and enters that sacred space of darn good storytelling. Nicole earned her journalism degree from UNC at Chapel Hill and her degree in illustration from the Savannah College of Art and Design. She lives and writes in Charleston, South Carolina with her family, all of whom are here apparently, and not in Charleston today. She is co-editor of and also a contributing essay to the forthcoming anthology, Our Prince of Scribes, Writers Remember Pat Conroy. Unlike many of our previous programs, our interviewer is also a visitor today. This is Bill Thompson, a book review editor, film critic, columnist, arts writer, and travel writer for the Charleston Post and Courier newspaper from 1980 until 2012. Bill is also a graduate of UNC at Chapel Hill and a former sports writer in Virginia and Florida. Bill's writing has been honored with many awards, and in his retirement he frequently reviews and writes for Kirkus Reviews, the Post and Courier, and Charleston Style and Design magazine. He is also the author of a book, that being Art and Craft, 30 Years on the Literary Beat. And unlike Bill, I have a copy of this book. So I want you all to join me in welcoming Nicole and Bill.
Good afternoon, everyone. What he omitted to mention was that I'm making an amiable nuisance of myself in retirement. Well, Nicole, it's good to be here with you again. And I wanted to, first off, as Jonathan said, it's your 7th novel, but first hardcover. And as we've talked about before, that obviously has certain meaning for you. Can you care to tell everyone?
Well, open up your book and see what I wrote to you.
Oh, I'm sure.
If you can read my scratch.
Oh, I think I'm asking that. Did they?
This is my first hardcover, and Bill and I go way back, a good decade. In fact, you came to my house one time and interviewed me.
I remember.
My children were little. I wore this shirt. I wore this shirt today in honor of that interview because it was a big deal when you came to my house. So the hardcover, what I wrote in there was I wrote a hardcover just so you would review it because we would meet at parties at Natalie's, and every book I had was not hardcover, and he was the book editor at Post and Courier, and he said, I can only review hardcover books. I'd be like, no problem. So actually, I never needed anything from Bill, and you never, there was never anything awkward. We just became friends because neither one could do anything for the other one except be friends. And then I finally wrote a hardcover.
What we could do in those cases, I inherited a policy that prohibited the review of paperbacks, which I objected to. But when we couldn't review someone's book, we would attempt to do an interview with them, which actually was often better read or more widely read than a review would have been. So in one sense, you benefited more maybe by having the interview.
Maybe so. But anyway, I'm really, truly, when the hardcover was coming out, you came into my head.
I'm mostly. Now, this particular book, and having it published by Story River Books, and discussing it here in Beaufort, in the shadow of Pat, does it have special significance for you?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, Jonathan Haupt is here. There would be no book if it weren't for Jonathan, and that is the truth. So thank you, Jonathan. We went to breakfast this morning, and I was sitting in a little cafe having my omelet, and I was looking around at the people, and I was thinking, this is Pat's town. I mean, he would be sitting here having coffee or having an omelet, and I just kind of looked around and just saw him. I just see him. I see him everywhere, so that's really special. The book, so this is a book that's published by Story River Books, but I will tell you how I came about to finding this imprint and how this imprint found me. I actually was invited to a party by another big author in Charleston. I had written this book. It was a New Orleans book. It was a historical. It was something out of my brand, if you will. My other 6 books have been Southern fiction. They've been somewhat spiritual books. And this was totally different. Literary, historical, mystery. And so I had written this book and had tried to sell it in different places for a while. I had an agent, and we worked, and it wasn't going anywhere. At one point, I think I'd run into Jonathan and said, hey, I've got this New Orleans novel, and back then I think they were doing more South Carolina, or focusing more on South Carolina books, or at least that's what I thought. So this night, I go to this event. It was at the South Carolina Aquarium. And I was supposed to get introduced to an editor that night. So I had written this book, and all of a sudden I needed to have an elevator pitch. Oh, I've got to know what this book is about. I've got to do it succinctly. And I came up with my elevator pitch as I was driving over there to meet the editor. And this was a very big party. The author was very, very busy. And I waited a long time. There was no way I could get up to this author and her editor. It wasn't going to happen. So after a while, I was like, and it's hard because I don't like spending time away from my kids. You know, it was a weeknight and school night, and so it was a big deal to go down there and make this happen. And I remember as I was about to leave, kind of with my tail between my legs, well, I guess that wasn't supposed to work out. I am walking out of the aquarium, and Jonathan and Lorraine are walking in, and we pass each other, and we stop, and we chat, and I said, I've still got that New Orleans book. And he said, well, Pat's wanting to spread out and do more regional books, and so that might just work. I said, well, really? And I had my elevator pitch, and I told it to him, and he said, that sounds fascinating. Send it to me. And over the next many months, I think we went back and forth. He's a phenomenal editor. He gave great insight and suggestions, and the book became better because of him. And I don't know what that was, but I think that meant I said something good. So Pat. So that was many months, and then I think this is 15? I think that would have been 2015. In October or November, I did an event on Hilton Head, and Pat Conroy was there. And I said, I waited for his line to slow down, which you know what his lines were like. And at my moment, I went over and I kind of knelt down next to him, and I said, I just want to thank you. I told him about this book, The Cage Maker. It was in Jonathan's hands, and at that time I thought maybe it was in Pat's hands as well. And I told him about it, and he said, "Well, tell Jonathan to send it to me immediately." And I said, "I will." And as I was walking away, I turned back to him, and I said, "Thank you for all you've done." And he said, "Well, I haven't done anything yet." I said, "Oh, you've done more than you'll ever know." And those were the last words I said to Pat. And then, fast forward several months, and on March 4th, which was the day that Pat passed away, about 2 or 3 hours before he passed, I got the note from Story River Books that they wanted to publish The Cage Maker. So the timing of it all has been very bittersweet. Yes, a lot of bitter and a lot of sweet in all of it. So.
Something's going to stay with you for a while. So
Absolutely. Yeah, there was definitely something to all the timing, and I would do all the waiting again for all of it. I'd go through it all.
I must say, it comes such a surprise to me that more editors editors of publishing houses and acquisition editors didn't jump at the book initially, because the plot summary alone, and as you said, the elevator pitch is fascinating. And there's a few things in this world that are truly original, but that came pretty darn close, wouldn't you say?
Well, I'd like to say so, but I wrote the book. So.
But it certainly has a lot of facets that are original. Before we get to the more specifically about the book, just curious, looking back, was there anything in your background or experiences that made becoming a novelist a foregone conclusion for you? Was it something, so many of the authors I interviewed over the years, they said that's all they ever wanted to do, whether it was fiction or nonfiction, beginning in, before they were 10 years old, 6 or 7, they were writing stories. Was that the case for you?
Gosh, when I was a child, I wrote poetry, and I had a few things in the newspaper when I was a child. We had an amazing, gifted and talented program at the public elementary school on Hilton Head, and this woman would introduce us to so many things, and I think I think that may have been where it came from. I was an early reader. When I was in first grade, I had somebody from third grade coming down to my room to bring me up to the third grade for reading. So I guess I was an early reader. But, my sister, I was the youngest of 3 kids, and I remember one time, I would get sort of stage fright if I was telling a story. I would tell a joke, and then I'd kind of forget the punchline once I got there. My sister told me that I couldn't tell a story. So I may have done it all just to spite her. I'm not sure.
What does she say now?
She says she's very proud of me. My mother also, she's a big reader. And every morning I would come downstairs and to have breakfast. And she would be down there with her glasses on and her nose in a book. And I wanted to go where she was. I knew she was not there when her head was in a book. And so one of the real blessings for me of becoming a writer is being able to share stories with her. We can talk books, and we can talk. Yeah. So I don't know if I ever wanted to be a novelist, but when the story struck, my first novel, The Spirit of Sweetgrass, I had the journalism degree and the time, the flexibility, raising my kids, working from home, and it just came together. I'm so glad it did.
Did you work as a journalist for a time?
I wrote for the Island Packet and the Bluffton Packet.
That's working as a journalist.
Okay, well, I was freelancing for those papers when I was going to Savannah College of Art and Design, getting a second degree in illustration. And the first article I ever wrote was about the town genealogist in Bluffton. I can't remember her name right this minute. Gerard, or I can't remember their name right now. But I took my tape recorder, and I went to this house, and I remember the oaks, the roots were buckled up through the asphalt, and the parrot was talking, and the gruff husband would talk back to the bird, and there were no, computers. They didn't have computers, so it was a town genealogist. And she knew everything about everyone in the town, and she had books and books all stacked over in a guest room, and that was the town genealogist. And I remember writing that story as my first feature. I loved writing features. I loved people, and I loved bringing them to life, and the sounds that you hear and all that.
Well, certainly the livelier end of journalism.
I would say that prepared me more than anything, was writing features about people, personalities.
Well, Hemingway allegedly said that newspaper work's good for a young writer as long as he or she gets out of it in time. And you got out in time. I waited 41 years before I got out. So Congratulations. Now, this next question is probably terribly broad, but both as a reader as well as a writer, what is most important to you in the writing of fiction? And secondly, what constitutes a successful work of fiction in your mind?
Of my own or another that I read?
Both.
And what was the first question?
Essentially, look at what's most important to you in the writing of fiction. What facets?
In the writing of fiction, I like fiction that transports. And I like fiction, it can transport me to another place. I love Khaled Hosseini and Amy Tan's works, and I love those books that take me to other countries. I'm sort of I dream of traveling the world. So any book that can do that is wonderful. And then, and I think history as well. I used to be, I hate to say this, I used to be really bored with history, and I think it was, I don't know, in school maybe.
That's the way it was taught.
Maybe, I'm not sure, but it didn't engage me like a language did, French or something else. And what's so sad is that I had to wait so many years to realize what I missed. And now I just think that the real stories that happen are crucial. I can read the Bible now and see all the real stories. I can read the newspapers, and when I look at a newspaper now, I see history in the making. That 20 years, 30 years, these things we're going to be reading back on them. Or when I read, or when I do genealogy and I read family histories, I see who we really are. One of my first characters, Essie Mae, in The Spirit of Sweetgrass, her mother told her, this is all in my head, you see, but it's in the book. But her mother told her that you have to know where you come from in order to know where you're going. And that bit of wisdom, I suppose came out of my head, but it didn't feel like it. That story kind of rushed out at me. And the older I get, the more I understand. I really do want to know where I come from, because it is. I don't think we really know who we are until we study those people who came before us.
So genealogy has become a fascination of yours.
It's a passion of mine. In fact, today I was just checking my email before I came over. I have a distant cousin that I met. I've never met, but we met online doing genealogy. Somebody up north on my father's side of the family. And she has a whole list of names that she sends around, and she just scanned in a bunch of photographs and sends them to all these cousins that she has met. And, I've scanned these in. We're trying to place who these people are, and we just look through them, and you see all these people who came before us, and it's fascinating to me, yeah.
I think one of the strengths of the Cage Maker, and we're talking about fiction, is the character development in it. And it's quite a feat because you have so many characters. There are some that are pivotal characters, and you could say they're the linchpin of the book, but there are so many rich characters. In your fiction, the 7 books you've done, which tends to get the greater emphasis for you? Is it character development? Is it plotting? What do you gravitate towards?
It is
mostly?
Definitely characters. The plotting is harder for me. The characters, if I am fortunate enough and a character comes to me that is a really strong character, he or she will come to me fully formed, and I just have to do the exploring, and this character kind of tells who they are, and once I get into character, the story writes itself. So I usually...
Don't tell readers that.
Well, no, meaning, you get in the zone, and usually I would start with, when I would get an idea for a book, this is before this one, of course, I would get an idea for a book, and I would kind of see a character or hear a character, something, I would know who the character innately was, who they are deep down, and I would have a vision of something at the end and where I wanted them to be or feel at the end. And that's really all I would get. That's all that would come to me. And then all I needed to do, it sounds very easy, but it would be pray about it and inhabit the character and just start typing, and the character would get into all sorts of... There was a book, Trouble the Water, which was my second novel. It was a sort of a retelling of my aunt's last year. If I were to creatively fictionalize that, I put her on a sea island with gullah nannies and all sorts of shenanigans. But I remember there was this one character, Duchess. And so my aunt's character, Honor, ends up having to go live with this woman. When she has fallen into hard times, and these Gullah women on the island are nursing her back to health, and one of the things they have her do is go and meet this woman, Duchess. And my character, Honor, walks up to the door and goes and knocks on the door, and I remember as soon as she opened the door, I started cracking up because my character, Duchess, was absolutely naked, and that was her character. She could not keep her clothes on. She had some issues, and so that character, so what I'm describing to you is I didn't pre-plan it. I get into character. I walk through their lives, and when I open doors, things happen, and I go with them. And that's how that was one of my favorite characters I ever wrote, was Duchess.
Well, you compounded your plotting challenge in this one by, you were telling me you like a book that transports you. This one certainly transports the readers through different time periods.
Right.
And different time periods mean different sensibilities. Quite a feat, I would say.
This book was totally different than anything I just described to you. This book was more like banging your head against a wall. Because I started with truth. I started with a real story and wanted to find a way to tell it. And because of that, I already had some plot. I already had some characters.
Oh, most definitely.
Some real characters. And I really wanted to stay as true to them as I could. And yet, I had been warned by this before. Sometimes when you're writing historical fiction, if you are too true to the real story, it can come off as dry or something. Like you've got to give yourself a little bit of license to lie a little bit and to make a better story. So that was a fine balance for me, was going, well, I know here are the facts and I want to stick to these, but then how do I tell it in a compelling way that will draw the reader in?
Well, your love of research and genealogy certainly had a confluence in this book. Much of the inspiration for the story came from your researches into family histories in New Orleans. So a lot of you know about this, perhaps some don't. If you care to elaborate on that.
All right. Well, my father was born in New Orleans, and I was researching that side of the family. We didn't grow up together, but I look like him. I look like that side of the family. And used to sing when I was younger. His mother was a singer, and so I knew there was a lot of genetics coming through on that side. And we of course have a wonderful relationship. But for many years we were, estranged. We didn't see each other very much. Well, part of that is sort of that there's a mystery forming. Because I just told you that in order to know who we are, we need to know where we came from and who came before us. And so I think a lot of growing up, not really looking like my mom and my sister and not really knowing my father's side of the family, made me wonder a bit about myself and where did I come from and who is this person who seems very, very unique and different from the others. So I was researching that side of the family, and my great-grandmother shared my birthday. As I was doing some research on Ancestry.com. Shared my birthday, and I thought that was interesting. We occasionally have that. I have a niece who has another, who shares a birthday with another great-grandmother of mine. And sometimes when you see those birthdays that are shared in families, it's kind of special. I don't know. And you wonder if there are traits that are passed on or shared. As I was researching her, I discovered her brother, Ferdinand. Ferdinand married a young woman in New Orleans. She was 15 years old when he married her. This is turn of the century, 1906, 7, something to that effect. And she inherited a lot of money. Her mother had passed away, and so she inherited a lot of money. Married him, inherited the money, and within a year she was dead. And when I found that, I said, well, I kind of need to know more here. What happened here? Was my ancestor at fault? Did something happen? And what I found as I was digging, I found the Louisiana Supreme Court cases. And I saw my family members up on the stand, and the father of the young girl coming after the money. So coming after my ancestor for the money. I just kind of needed to know what had happened there. I started to care about this young girl, and as I continued to research, I found that her younger sister, Gladys, she eloped a couple years later at age 14. She inherited the money, and within a year she was dead.
Scary.
And as soon as I found these two girls, and the father came after the money again, I found the cases. So at that point, I was kind of done. I had to find out. First of all, nobody knew about this. Nobody, when you discover something like that it wasn't my family history anymore. As I kept going, it was this other family that kind of touched mine in New Orleans. But I was fascinated. Who are these girls? What happened to them? And then I was the caretaker of this knowledge. Like, did anybody else know what happened to these young girls? Here I was 100 years later, finding out all of this stuff, and all of a sudden I felt the burden of needing to know for their sake what happened. And oh my goodness, I follow the money. I just started to follow the money. Where did the money come from? And I kept going back, and I went to one of the wealthiest families in New Orleans, and kind of discovered how this family money passed on. And I don't know how much we need to get into, but I was hooked. And it took about 3 years to do the research.
It's such rich material. Did you ever entertain the idea at any juncture of doing a nonfiction account of this family history?
I did. And actually, that's what I did for a long time. That's probably what I did. I wasn't even thinking fiction. And I remember thinking, I'm not a writer anymore. I'm a researcher. I mean, I just gave myself over to the research. I just needed to know the story. So I probably a year and a half to 2 years of just doing research and getting the story and getting the documents and the death certificates and the newspaper articles and getting all of that together. But at that point, I am a writer, and at that point, I'm like, I've got to do something with this. And I'm a novelist. I'm a novelist. I actually think I tell truth better in fiction. I think some people tell it better in fiction, and some people tell it in nonfiction, and I just kind of know myself now. And I like I can read a novel of someone else's and get a lot of truth out of it. Made up stories speak truth to me.
Were your researches done in 1 or 2 or 3 locations, or was it widespread that you have to go to a number of places to?
Well, it's back in the 1800s, and so I did much of it digitally, and I think my son's asleep. I did a lot of it digitally.
I'll ask you a question about soccer or something in a moment.
Yeah, you're going to have to, just ask him a question in a minute.
Well, your narrative technique was to one of them was to employ letters and journal entries throughout. But what impressed me is how you segued from one to the other and from time period to time period so seamlessly. What made you think that this particular technique or approach was going to be the most successful way of telling a story? Because it was in different time periods?
I'm not sure if by the time it came to you, Jonathan, if it was in epistolary form or not. It wasn't, was it? Okay. So I guess it was partially in epistolary form when Jonathan got a hold of it. And we did, one of the hardest things was how do you tell the story? There's so much information. There's so many characters. The plot is so intricate. How do you tell it? I had my narrator, Dr. Lemonnier. I didn't discover him until much, much later in my research. And I remember when I was trying to figure out how to tell this story, I've got all these disparate pieces. In my old life as a writer with Thomas Nelson, I know that they probably would have wanted me to go get in one of the young girls' points of view and tell the story that way. More women's fiction, this type of thing. I tried. That was not happening at all. And I really struggled with how to tell the story. One day, there's a house that is very important in this book. There's a house on Royal Street. And these families are connected, and there's a house sort of at the core of it. I don't know. Have we even told what the Cage Maker is about? I haven't even said
that. I was going to get
to. Okay, well, hold on. Okay, well, I'll just.
Well, no, I think we should before we go on.
I was just thinking.
A brief synopsis of it, and this, I think, is from some of the publicity surrounding the book. Bringing the New Orleans of the late 1800s and early 1900s vividly to life, Nicole Seitz' latest novel unfolds as a series of letters, journal entries, and newspaper articles discovered in the secret compartment of an enormous and exquisitely detailed birdcage that Trish, a 21st century blogger, has inherited from a heretofore unknown relative. As she peruses the documents, Trish finds herself irresistibly drawn into the history of her family, a tale that is, as one letter puts it, part love story and part horror and madness. That's pretty accurate description. To what extent, and this is something we talked about before, to what extent is the novel based on real people and events?
The young girls, so Carmelite Curricar is actually the name of the young girl. My ancestor's last name was Curricar. Then I would change names, last names, here or there. I felt like because this one was married into the family that I could keep that name, and the rest I kept partial names or I changed them. But she and her sister Gladys were real. Their brother Andrew was real, and all the stuff that happened with each one of them was real. So Gladys and Carmelite both died. Andrew is the brother, and he has been accused of murder of his prostitute lover. And the whole concept of, as I was researching this story and finding that terrible things were happening to everyone who got their hands on this money. As I'm reading through this, I read an article in which Andrew was interviewed. Andrew's, awaiting his sentence, and he claims that there is a curse on the money. And I didn't make that up. I couldn't make that up, but it's what I was seeing. So my main narrator, Dr. Lemonnier, he's the head of the insane asylum. He is the city physician and coroner. He's a real character. He was a Civil War veteran. He actually wrote about the Battle of Shiloh, and so he's a real character. And he is the one who is enlisted to try to save this young man from a death sentence. So the sister Carmelite comes to him and says, please help my brother, because his attorneys are wanting to claim he's insane, and that's why he killed her. And so this man is pulled in. He has the insane asylum, the head of the insane asylum. He is pulled in to try to help this young man get off of a death sentence. And when he's pulled in, his life is just completely intertwined with this really dark family. So Andrew, Carmelite, Gladys, they were all real. Dr. Lemonnier is real. Now, in the way that they interacted with him, may or may not be real.
Certain license could be taken.
Right. There was a lot of license.
I think one of the challenges in fiction is to get inside, for a writer, is to get inside the heart and mind of a character of the opposite sex, and then render their voice persuasively. That's not easy. And that's not what you set out to do initially, but Lemonnier becomes the principal male voice.
Lemonnier does,
a strong one.
And his voice, I learned his voice because he wrote. He wrote letters to the editor. He wrote General Beauregard at Shiloh. So I could read his personality in different things. And so he came alive to me from his own readings. But it's Francois. Francois is the birdcage maker.
The most poignant figure, certainly.
He is my beloved Francois. Francois is a birdcage maker. We have an ancestor who was a birdcage maker on St. Anne Street in New Orleans. And it was another ancestor, not connected, but that as soon as I found out that I had an ancestor who was a birdcage maker, that's what they were listed as in the 1800s. That blew me away. I loved the visuals of that. And so I held on to that piece for a long time. And when I was writing this book, here comes the birdcage maker, and he is actually the one who ties this entire book together through the birdcage itself.
Have you always been drawn to the period piece as a reader and a writer?
No,
No,
I don't think so. Travel, perhaps, the period in other countries, 1800s or earlier times in other countries, but not here. It really has not been that much of an interest. I just fell in love with the people. The people who lived 100, 150 years ago, they just weren't so different from you and me. They really weren't. And that was one of the things that was stunning to me, is to find out if you were to set you and I just back 150 years, don't give us this camera, don't give us these electric lights, we'd be getting along and having the conversations that we might be writing novels, we might be doing all the things we normally do. We just wouldn't have all of the things that we have now, but we'd be, in essence, very similar people. And that's what's striking about these characters.
I think some people forget that. They think people in the dim recesses of history were radically different from us. They weren't.
No, they weren't. Nor
certainly not.
We don't seem to be evolving much either.
Do you feel that in some ways you exercise, this is maybe kind of a trite question, exercise some different literary muscles in the writing of this book? Because certainly it's ambitious. I mean, one of the things, in the process of telling this story, I'm going to read this, it reveals much about criminal justice, about early 20th century notions of care for the mentally ill, most importantly about the ways in which the weight of history hangs over the present from one generation to the next. That takes out a lot of ground.
The last part, how the weight of one generation hanging over the next, that's not anything new for me. In fact, I've got several other books that deal with that. So that's actually something that's innately how I think and how I believe. But the criminal justice system and the insane asylum and all that, no. In fact, I remember I have a lawyer friend, and when I knew I wanted to tell the story and I was in all this research, I was really struggling with reading all these old court cases.
Because they were dry, or?
It's just not something I had done much of. I've never, when you're a novelist, or I guess when you're writing anything, you go and you research something new that you never have before. You try to learn everything you can about it, but there's a starting point you have to get over that barrier, and then once you get into it, it's fine. But the court cases and the reading the lingo, I had to really look up those kinds of things to figure out what exactly was happening. So I guess that was a challenge. But Dr. Lemonnier, I'm a collector of the curious. So if I see something that is fascinating to me, I remember it, I document it, I keep notebooks.
I was going to ask, are you a note taker?
I'm a note taker. I have notebooks. I take photographs. If I see something that fascinates me, I grab onto it, catalog it, because it might show up in a book someday. I know that about myself. And as I was doing all this research, I accidentally ran across the insane asylum records that are online in New Orleans, late 1800s. And I was fascinated with how dark it all was, how these people were treated, how they were chronicled, how I could look at these people and see what we know today. I could see what was wrong with them, and it would break your heart to see these people who were in an insane asylum. And I remember every now and then I would just go look at those records and think, oh, maybe I'd write something about one of these people one of these days. And I was at a point in my research with the cage maker where I'd be waiting on records, or I couldn't find what I needed, and I just hit a brick wall, and nothing would happen for weeks. And one day I just decided to go look at those insane asylum records again. And as I looked, I don't know, I'd looked at them 100 times. I looked up at the top of the page at the attending physician, and it was Dr. Lemonnier. Well, I had been researching this family and where where this money came from, and there was a house involved with it, and it was called the Lemonnier Mansion. And I'd been doing all this research on this house, and then here is the man whose family had built that. So when that happened, it was like, everything aligned, and I saw finally how to tell the story. And
a lot of happy surprises in your research, no doubt.
Yeah.
You told me in a previous conversation that every new book is your most ambitious.
Yeah.
But I take it this one's the most ambitious to date for you.
It is to date, yes. And the next one, whatever that will be even more challenging.
Can we ask you what might be percolating?
Trying to find the time to write is the big challenge. I do have a story that is another historical novel that I have been researching for a long time. It's not as far along as I would like before I talk about it, so that one's going on. But I also would love to write young adult and middle grade fiction. So sometimes when I sit down to write...
Have you done that before? Is this new idea?
No, it's just something I've dreamed about. I taught art for 7 years. I taught children. I love kids, and I would teach them summer camps with my daughter. We would do creative writing summer camps and around the world art camps, and I just often think about those kids and the high school kids that I taught. I just really cared about them. And fiction, I see a lot of the books that my own kids have the opportunity to pick up now. Some of it is really, really good work. Some of it I don't necessarily want them to be reading. So I just realized that books are really powerful. And I would love to be able to impact kids again. Maybe that's my way of teaching without teaching, maybe through a book.
We haven't talked about your illustrations. The
Yeah.
book is amplified with and strengthened by a number of illustrations in there. What came first for you when you were young? Was it drawing, or was it storytelling, or was drawing one of your forms of storytelling?
I think probably writing. I think probably reading and writing first. I don't know. I remember doing really nerdy things, like we had, the old full set of encyclopedias.
Oh, me too.
Yeah. And I loved them. Really loved them. Mm-hmm. And I would go through and find, like, the snakes page, and I'd get a piece of paper and I would copy and draw all the snakes and all the colors. And those are things I did when I was a kid. But I took AP Art in high school by Catherine Ramser-Glick. She's still over at Hilton Head Prep.
Oh, really? Still?
She's still there. And she was just a phenomenal teacher. She helped me to continue taking it in college, and then I went for illustration. So I don't know. I think what I had always envisioned when I got a little older was I would write and travel for, say, Condé Nast, and they would send me all over the world, and I would write, and I would also do illustrations for Gourmet. I'd do the little. I would eat well, and I would travel well, and then I would write and draw it, and that's really what I thought I would be doing.
Over 7 books in the years that you've been a writer, professionally. Has the writing life offered the sorts of rewards you had expected and hoped for?
I don't know what I expected and hoped for. My first agent said, "Let's go make millions." So I suppose I expected that, and that didn't happen. So I guess that's.
Let's go make hundreds.
I guess that's the first mark, right?
Yeah.
Let's just go make enough for gas money, right? Bill knows what I'm talking about. What has been truly unexpected. When I first started writing, I was working at home. I had a web design business. And I had a bunch of wonderful clients that I would see through my emails. That's pretty much what I did. I'd work in my pajamas, and I'd raise the kids, and my husband would go off and do his work. And I really thought, I had it made. It's like, thank you, Lord. This is exactly what I had in mind. As soon as I wrote the first novel, I had to get out and start promoting the novel. I wasn't expecting. I didn't know anything about that. That was what was most shocking to me, by far, is how I fell in love with the people that I met. I've got one here too. I remember going around talking about my book. There is something about fiction that draws readers to writers, and you can connect in a book. You can connect in a very intimate way. It's as if you've shared a life experience together, and that's really powerful. And in doing this, somehow people, when they would come up to me and speak with me, or I would speak to them, they'd come up afterwards. They would share things with me. They would share their lives with me. There was a barrier that completely is gone when you are a writer going out and speaking with readers. There is nothing between you. And I don't know that I had ever experienced that before. So I just started really, I'm not sure how much I cared. I mean, I cared about my family, of course, but I'm not sure how much I reached out of myself and cared about other people before that, because I'm a sort of an introvert. And all of a sudden, I started caring on a very deep level about complete strangers that I would meet, and I would think about, and I would pray about, and they would pray for me. And very unexpected. Worth it all.
Just looking at a photograph of Pat back there, and you have been a teacher. And of course, the intersection of teaching and writing was very important to him. How has the one informed the other for you personally? If it has.
Well, I didn't plan to teach either, so I think when I started teaching and made those connections and had those aha moments with my students, what I realized was, I guess I'd always, in a way, been a teacher with the books. I think that we can teach through our writing, but most importantly, I think when you're a reader, you're into self-learning. You're into continued education. That's what you do. And I am a bit of a learning addict. I just can't get enough. And so whether it's fiction or nonfiction, so I think now that I've been a teacher, I would say I suppose I always was. And Pat was.
Oh, definitely.
Pat was for sure.
Even for a short time.
But Pat continued teaching on a one-to-one basis. Anybody he met, he taught.
I imagine it's gratifying to have Cassandra Conroy having written the foreword to the book.
Absolutely. She, Cassandra has been amazing through all this. She is the most generous, genteel, lovely woman. And she's been through so much. And in all of this, she didn't have time or the wherewithal to write a foreword to this book. And she did such a magnificent job with it. In fact, when I usually, if I'm doing a talk and I'm reading out of it, I usually go to her foreword and read out of that, because that to me means so much. But she just did it in Conroy style. Pat Conroy went out of his way for everyone. It didn't matter, for kings or paupers, he was the same. And I feel like a pretty lucky pauper with Cassandra's.
I'm curious how readers, fans of your previous books, have received this one. What kind of feedback have you been getting?
I've actually gotten really good feedback. I was nervous.
Because it is a bit of a change of pace.
Yeah, I was a bit nervous with it because it's literary in style. It's told in an epistolary fashion. I think Jonathan was the one, my editor was the one who pushed me over, what if you try it completely epistolary? Every single thing. And that was, can this be done? Can we do this? And went through, and sure enough, I think it came together. What you end up with is I think it's a gift to the reader, somebody who likes to discover things. When you get to flip open a book and it's as if you're discovering all the letters and the journal entries, and you've discovered the notebooks and the newspaper articles, and I just think that would be a gift to me. I love books like Elizabeth Kustova's The Historian. I don't know if you've ever read that. It is just rich and meaty, and it's told in letters. I don't know if it's all told in letters or partially told in letters. But the letters, I remember being struck by the letters giving that intimate look, and then it takes you back into what was happening in the present day, and then you go back to the letters, and it would reveal more and more. This is kind of this way. Dracula is similar. And what was the book? The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Society. I don't know if anybody's read that. It's all told in letters. So I just think that's fun. I like to work a little when I'm reading. I like to work a little, and so I'm hoping that my readers enjoy working a little. You've got to keep things together. I've had people. I do put a family tree in here or two. I've had people say, I'm keeping my own tree. And I'm like, well, there's one later. And they're like, no, I've got to keep my own tree. And I'm keeping it, and I'm figuring out who everybody is. They really want to figure out the things that I was figuring out.
Well, I agree. I think all good books, works of art of any kind, challenge their reader and viewer. Otherwise, they don't really serve the purpose they might.
Right.
I'd asked you a moment ago about the writing life. What if one of your kids comes to you in a few years and say, Mom, I really want to be a writer. Are you going to be thrilled or petrified?
I could say what Pat Conroy told me, which is, if you got to do it, you got to do it. He said without much enthusiasm. And I think he would tell them to do anything, if you could do anything but. But I see, to me, I don't know. I think they probably won't, because I think they probably won't, especially as they see what writing life is really like.
Well, it can be, even when you're surrounded by family, it can be a bit of a lonely proposition, writing fiction particularly. If you're doing nonfiction, you're doing countless interviews and you're going out and you're with people a great deal of the time, notwithstanding the time you're doing researches. And as for writing, certainly books of history or literary history, things like that.
You know what? I could describe the writing life as part love story, part horror and madness.
Oh, you seem sane enough to me.
And I wouldn't change a thing. It is the most fun when you are truly writing. And writers understand this. When I meet other writers, this is why when we go to a conference, we go to something where writers can get together. Somebody who writes fiction, when you sit down with them, they understand the workings of your brain. Mm-hmm. And it's, my family loves me and supports me, but I'm not sure they really understand how everything works up in there.
I don't want to over-romanticize it, but do you feel compelled to be a writer? As I mentioned earlier, over 30-some years, I interviewed a great many writers, many of them novelists, and I would say 85 to 90%, again, said it's all they ever wanted to do since they were children. I became a writer halfway through college as an architectural student, never having a clue I wanted to be a writer. Of course, then again, I'm not a true writer, don't write fiction. No. But does it something that you, like you were mentioning earlier, Pat, something you had to do? There was no choice in the matter?
There's a turning point, or where there's a no turning back point. And I don't know when that point happens. It might happen with the first book. It might happen once you turn in a book and the editor doesn't like it, and you have to start from scratch and start all over, and you pick yourself up again.
Has that happened to you?
Oh, yes. Book 4. Yeah. It might happen when you find that what you're made of, and you can do that. It might be when a writer or a reader comes up to you with tears in their eyes and says, "Thank you for writing this book. I read it one day, and my mother passed away the next day, and you allowed me to imagine what heaven was like." And there are so many points where you, even if you wanted to, you can't turn back. Nor do I think I would want to. It's the adventure of a lifetime.
Can't say much more than that. Anyone have a question?
Yes.
Did you run into any big holes in your story that you had to fill in with fiction?
Gosh. I don't know that I experienced big holes when it all came together. I noticed big holes when I couldn't get the answers I needed in my research, where I just hit a place where I couldn't pass any further. What would happen would be there was nothing else to find, and then all of a sudden I would kind of give up, go back. Something would tell me, "Why don't you go check such and such again?" And I would go check the thing again like I'd done 1,000 times, and something new would be there. If it was this timing, it literally just wasn't there. In fact, when the book was done, I remember I remember doing a bit of research, and I had been pulling for several years, pulling and trying to get certain answers, and couldn't get anything. And one day, the timing happened where I got some answers that I wanted, and I started doing some research online about it. It was regarding a health issue, and I was trying to connect some dots, and I remember everything said that such and such wasn't, the dots didn't connect. And I found one person at a university hospital who said that they did connect. And I remember calling this person out of the blue and saying, or writing him a note and saying I was working on this book and had discovered such and such, and I'm trying to connect these dots, and no one but you is saying they connect. And he wrote me back and said, call me immediately, and if I'm teaching, have somebody come in and get me. And he gets me on the phone, and I tell him what I've been working on, and he says, I just published a paper yesterday that would work with what you're talking about. And talk about timing. Mm-hmm. There's like nothing, you will only get what you're supposed to get when you're supposed to get it. And that's one of the hardest, no holes, but gaps in time, I would say.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
And we'll get down to 10 million.